Red Bull just axed its special livery for the Singapore Grand Prix, thinking that they would need to find every which way to reduce weight on that car so that they could find a way to at least get into a respectable top 10 at the Singapore Grand Prix. That just shows how tough things are at Red Bull. I also think that they should have listened to Sergio Perez. I never thought I was going to ever make that comment, but it seems like not listening to your number 2 driver has left them with a car that is a dormant monster that now none of the drivers are able to drive to gain the dominance that they were able to extract in 2023. This is another video about some rumors on the paddock before the Singapore Grand Prix. Welcome you beautiful people, my name's Lucky. Let's get right into it. Red Bull just announced that they're gonna axe their special livery. A special livery naturally means more paint. More paint equals more grams in the car. So that just outlines how tough of a time that Red Bull's having. They're trying to find every which way to maintain some form of performance that is respectable. But I think the bigger problem is they've gone back through their upgrade plan all the way to 2023 Spain and figured out that that was the point at which they had taken a turn that ultimately ended up with the fall of grace during this season. If we go back and think of who complained at that point in time, it was Sergio Perez, right? So Sergio's form from 2023 onwards has been relatively downbeat. Apart from the obvious tracks that he is good at, when I say he's good at, the tracks that suit his driving style, i.e. slow corners and long straights, example Baku or Singapore, or potentially sometimes Saudi, right, or Monaco. These are tracks that he's inherently done well and therefore he is able to drive around with the problems of the car. But he was the first to complain about the change in the characteristics of the car. But what did Red Bull do? They actually went ahead and went down that development trajectory because Max was out driving the car. Yes, he had those problems, but because it is Max and he's able to extract something ultimately a bit extraordinary from that car, the problems went unnoticed. And the other side of it is that the rest of the grid were almost stumbling on themselves as well. McLaren was nowhere at the start of last year and they were too far away to catch up anyway. Mercedes was floundering around with the zero pod concept still, and then they didn't have the right chassis when they brought the upgraded side pods mid-season. Ferrari was battling with tyre wear issues versus quali pace, right? So in terms of overall top contenders for the championship, Red Bull really didn't have any actual competition. Christian Horner ultimately did come out and make the statement that we did not take Sergio's comments seriously enough. I think it's been a relatively common tale with Red Bull because Red Bull has always favored the top driver. That was the same story with Alex when he was a teammate for Max. It was the same with Pierre, and it is the same with Sergio. But simply the fact that one driver or their number 1 driver was able to drive that car to the maximum was sufficient. And especially last year, that was good enough because the car was so dominant. Now you're in a situation where both your drivers are ultimately not able to contend in the front, and that is partly where things get even more complicated, right? So would you go down the route where Sergio suggests, thinking that Max has had enough with Red Bull, with everything related to Red Bull, right? So the friction that his team or his dad has with the Christian Horner side of things, Adrian Newey leaving the Red Bull team, or there are other pull factors from like Mercedes with a potential engine overhaul that would apply largely to translate to become the most powerful team or the most dominant team in 2026. Or does that mean that he wants to follow Adrian Newey and go into Aston Martin, which has so much promise and might actually deliver in 2026. I think Red Bull ultimately is in this weird space of, do we go down the route that ultimately Max thinks that the car needs to go towards, or whether we need to find a compromise where the car can ultimately be better for both drivers. And I think that might be a recipe for disaster, because I don't necessarily think that a team can adopt and create a car that is very pliable across two very different driving styles. Anyway, that's my 2 cents about Red Bull, its future, and its development direction. Moving on to softer topics. We've got 3 new liveries to look at for the Singapore Grand Prix. Let's rank them, whether they are better than their normal livery and whether they should stay on the grid. Let's have a look at McLaren. It seems like all they've done is kind of removed a little layer of fire and then put a whole load of white paint around it. But actually, it does look nice. I don't know whether that's because they've created this simulated auditorium around them, but I do think it could look good under especially the lights. Thumbs up for the McLaren. Let's look at RB. Okay. All they've done is just replace the side pods and the nose with a denim looking color. But it looks like someone tried to do something and then they forgot the top. I'm not a big fan of this one. This is a massive thumbs down for me. I don't like the colors either. I think it could have been better if they actually went with like a denim paint job across the car, but avoid having this bluish, purplish kind of upper top part. Yeah, it just doesn't work. Next is Mercedes. Okay, so all they've done is actually replaced the majority of the silver with the Petronas blue. I think on this one, it does look nice, but it's probably because there's neon lights and so forth. It'd be curious to see whether it actually looks like another Aston Martin under the lights of Singapore. Actually, do you know what? I think the side profile is pretty nice. Maybe it might work. I don't know. I'm gonna go flat with that one. I want to see that on track, and then on the post-race, we'll have a look at that. So I wanted to talk about how Lando might have felt, because post-race on the radio, Lando's race engineer was saying, "Oh, Lando, you really helped out on Oscar's win, and it's really appreciative. Without you, we couldn't have done that." And I can't help but think that this was the first weekend where McLaren came out and said, "Oh yeah, we're gonna bias any of our decisions towards Lando," and then Oscar drives one of the best races ever. The tables turned to the point that McLaren had to ask Lando to actually do something to help Oscar win the race. Over the course of the last few races where Lando should have won or secured at a minimum a second place, the problem that McLaren has is that the other driver is outperforming. And it's impressive, right? Over the course of the last 5 races, Oscar's had 2 second places and won the other 2 races. Whereas Lando, he's not maximizing opportunities where he can actually gain the most amount of points, whilst Red Bull is really struggling. And that might turn around in Austin when Red Bull is supposedly going to bring a potential upgrade package that can turn things around. So I'm doubtful that might be the case, but at the same time, when you are granted the opportunity, you should grab it with both hands, is my point. Peter Windsor was explicitly mentioning this on his chat with Cameron on one of the podcasts, that Lando must be really reveling at the point, right? Because ultimately he wanted to win that race, whereas tables have turned and then you've got this kid who's almost outshining him. Oh, also, if you guys want to, I have already dropped a video about how good or bad Oscar is compared to Lando. Lando needs to find the right balance or mental stability in terms of coming through this and then ensuring come Singapore, where we would probably all bet against Red Bull, he maximizes that gap to Max and ensure that there are no second questions about who McLaren should be pushing for the Drivers' Championship, at least for this year. Also, on the Red Bull front, there's rumors that Ricciardo might be replaced next year, and Helmut Marko alluded to this a few races ago, but it seems that it may be even more imminent than the next season, right? So Ricciardo hasn't really outshone Tsunoda, and ever since McLaren, actually ever since his move away from Red Bull to Renault to McLaren, and it's been a downward trajectory on his career. Yes, there was the Monza, especially as the race win for McLaren, or the podiums at Renault. But that said, Ricciardo over the course of this season especially has not outperformed Tsunoda. And if you define the purpose of RB to be develop junior drivers, Tsunoda's had 3-4 seasons already, and then naturally the best placed seat for Lawson should be that. And then the question becomes, do you really shift out Sergio and then move Ricciardo into the Red Bull seat? I don't know whether that makes any sense or not, right? And I didn't think I'm ever going to say this, but I think Sergio ultimately was outdone by the development direction that Red Bull had taken, because Max just simply outdrove the car to the point that the car just remained a dormant and a sleeping diva at some point when it just flipped over. You know what? I'm not going to work for either of the drivers. I think ultimately Lawson will get placed, but maybe not during this season. Last but not least, let's wrap up with Ferrari upgrade news. So they've brought in a new front wing, and this was expected, and this was coming for a while. This is on the back of Ferrari and Red Bull requesting FIA to assess both Mercedes and McLaren flexi front wings, right? So ultimately the point was that McLaren and Mercedes are bending the rules in such a way that they have the ability to flex the front wing under load down the straight and unload it in turns so that they can maximize aeroelasticity, right? If you guys are curious what aeroelasticity is, I'm going to do a separate video. Ultimately, I'm curious to see whether Ferrari has learned a trick from either Mercedes or McLaren or both of them, and they have introduced their own flexi wing, and how that will translate into performance in Singapore. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.